This is a phrenology bust. It's a white porcelain skull with dotted lines showing the underlying regions of the brain. Back in the 1800s, a phrenologist would feel the bumps on your skull and see how the bumps matched up to the bust. And Americans loved this stuff. They'd consult phrenologists before making big life decisions, and in general, loved the novelty of learning about themselves. But phrenology was also used to justify some high-level bigotry, and kicked off an age of scientific racism that peaked during World War II. So today, we'll look at how phrenology became a thing, how it was corrupted, and how a dude with hundreds of skulls in his closet helped debunk it. This video was made with the support of viewers like you on Patreon. Back in the 1700s, academics were getting obsessed with using observation and science to explain the natural world, and by the late 1700s, a bunch of them wondered if science could also help them explain human behavior, something that really only fell under the umbrella of spirituality back then. In 1775, a Swiss theologian named Johann Lavater tried to deduce people's character from their faces, what he called physiognomy. So a long forehead meant intelligence, short foreheads indicated volatility, and so on. Lavater never did any research with it, but that was normal for this kind of Enlightenment-era science. He was just looking for any observable phenomenon that might explain human character, and in doing so, he started this idea that outward appearance reflected one's inner psychology. Now, at the same time, there was this big debate within neuroscience. On one team, there were people who thought the brain was one homogeneous organ that processed everything together. The other team subscribed to something called the cerebral localization theory, this idea that different sections of the brain process different things. Some people called these processing centers faculties, while others called them organs. One of the ways that people investigated this question was by observing lots and lots of skulls, and this was very much an upper-class European man thing. Some of these collectors were anatomists who wanted to learn things about the person who the skull belonged to, but others used the skulls more like trophies than as educational materials. It was as racist and unethical as you imagine, and it was way too common. So we've got skull collectors, face interpreters, and people debating how the brain worked. That's the world that Franz Joseph Gall was born into. He's our main character today. Growing up, Gall was the smartest of his 11 brothers and sisters and smartest of his classmates, according to him anyway. One day, he noticed that the few of his classmates that were smarter than him all had bulging eyes. Then when he grew up and went to medical school, he noticed the same thing about his colleagues. So he made the totally logical, not at all compensating conclusion that their brains were so big that it made their eyes pop out. Sure, he was doing the same thing that Lavater was doing, assigning an inner personality trait to some kind of outward appearance. Gall became a doctor in 1785, started a private practice in Vienna, and started working at a mental asylum soon afterwards. And Gall was super into the idea of having so many mentally ill people in one area. Just like how all those smart classmates had big eyes, he knew that everyone in the asylum had a common personality trait. They were all deemed to be insane. So he goes looking for things that the inmates all have in common, and finds that they had bumps on the sides of their heads, which he sees as a physical manifestation of their insanity. Was it confirmation bias? Almost certainly. Gall made other sweeping conclusions about human anatomy from sample sizes of 2 people. This is not rigorous science, even at this point. In 1791, he published his first big piece of work, which translates to Philosophical Medical Investigations into Nature and Art in the Sick and Healthy State of Man. In the book, he disavows the popular metaphysical, philosophical views of medicine and advocates for a more evidence-based approach. He also takes a stance in favor of the cerebral localization theory instead of thinking of the brain as a homogeneous organ. But in order to prove he was right, he would need evidence. So in 1792, he started collecting skulls. Gall would eventually collect over 300 human skulls, including the skulls of 103 famous men, 67 mental patients, 69 nice criminals, and a few wax molds of the brain within the skull. But he wasn't just thinking about cerebral localization. He was coming up with an entire system for understanding the brain. By 1796, he started giving lectures from his house about some of his ideas, this system that would become known as phrenology. It went like this. Number 1, the brain is an organ of the mind. Number 2, the brain is a collection of multiple separate faculties that function independently of each other. Number 3, each faculty has its own organ in the brain. By the way, Gall identified 27 different faculties, but later phrenologists claimed there were up to 35. Number 4, the more active an organ, the larger its size. 5, the shape of the brain is made by the development of all these organs. And number 6, the contours of the skull can be used to estimate the size of each organ, and thus The bumps on the skull represent the characteristic represented by the underlying organ. That last one is the big one. According to Gall, surface-level skull anatomy could tell you about the brain underneath it. Now, Gall never called this system phrenology. The term was coined by a British physician in 1815, and that's the name that stuck. Gall preferred calling his system organology, or brain physiology, or the doctrine of the skull. In 1798, he's quoted as saying, "I hear that scholars have baptized the child before it has come into the world. They name me a craniologist, and my proposed science, craniology." Gall starts getting the word out about his new system by giving lectures around Vienna. And one day, there was a young medical student in the audience named Johann Spurzheim. He loved what he was hearing, and he quickly became Gall's right-hand man on the lecture circuit. But these lectures were kind of controversial at the time. The old-school church dogma said that morality and character came from a non-physical soul, and here was Gall saying that you could measure it in the brain, and Spurzheim agreed. He's quoted as saying, "One fact is to me more positive and decisive than 1,000 metaphysical opinions." This pissed off the Catholic Church, who saw phrenology as opposed to intelligent design, which means it also pissed off the government, and in 1801, the emperor forbade Gall from teaching and researching in Vienna anymore. So if Gall wanted phrenology to spread, he'd have to get out of Vienna. And in 1805, he and Spurzheim started a lecture tour around the rest of Europe. Gall gave lessons, and Spurzheim did dissections. And that's when phrenology took off. Gall and Spurzheim exposed phrenology to a bunch of scientists across Europe with this lecture tour, and this kicked off the scientific age of phrenology, which lasted from about 1800 to about 1830. Now, their tour ended in 1807, at which point Gall retired in Paris and Spurzheim became the frontman for the movement. In 1813, Spurzheim did a lecture tour throughout the UK, which was very well received. He presented to influential scientists, philosophers, and politicians, which helped popularize phrenology throughout Britain and turned Gall into a bit of a posthumous celebrity. But he also got some pushback. A famous French scientist and racist named Georges Cuvier criticized phrenology by saying Gall didn't really have any new ideas, and that they hadn't even written a book, they'd only done lectures. And in 1815, the Scottish Dr. John Gordon published a brutal takedown of phrenology in the Edinburgh Review, saying, quote, "We look upon the whole doctrine taught by these two modern peripatetics, anatomical, physiological, and physiognomical, as a piece of thorough quackery from beginning to end, and we are persuaded that every intelligent person who takes the trouble to read a single chapter of the volumes below us will view them precisely in the same light." That's rough, dude. But that article inspired Spurzheim to come to Scotland and debate Gordon, and do some lectures on the side. One of the men who watched these lectures was a Scottish lawyer named George Combe, and he became a big fan of phrenology. He started a Phrenological Society in 1820, which went on to publish the Phrenological Journal and the Phrenological Transactions, which were big deal publications within the system. And all of this allowed Combe to not only promote phrenology, but to publicly debate the critics also. Within just 5 years, Edinburgh went from the city where phrenology was considered thorough quackery to the place where it was promoted more than anywhere on earth. But things were starting to take a turn behind the scenes. Spurzheim and Gall had a falling out in 1812, at which point Spurzheim started tweaking some of the basics of phrenology. One of his changes was renaming some of the faculties of the brain to be more approachable to everyday people. What Gall called the organ of murder, Spurzheim called destructiveness. Right? Murder is scary sounding. Even if it's a tiny bump, nobody likes being told that they scored positive for murderousness. On the other hand, everyone's a little destructive. Like, who hasn't accidentally broken something before? Spurzheim also earned a lot of points by claiming that people could change their brains through treatment and exercise. He was like a 19th century self-help guru. His version of phrenology gave individuals more agency than the old version, and not surprisingly, this was way more popular with the lay public. In 1832, Spurzheim came to the US for a lecture tour, and phrenology exploded in popularity after that. He became an instant medical celebrity and was invited to be part of the graduation ceremony at Yale and lecture in Boston medical societies. Unfortunately, he got typhoid and died 3 months into his tour. But after his death, some folks in Boston started their own Phrenological Society, which helped popularize the system in America. And by popularize, I mean gatekeep. These early phrenology fans were the elite, white, landowning men of Boston, which included doctors, lawyers, judges, and politicians, and they hated the idea of pop phrenology. This was a very serious science. It should be reserved for the anatomy labs and lecture halls of educated men. A system where only rich white men claim to understand how the body works. There's no way this could go wrong. So while phrenology was going through this messy adolescence, Adolphe Quetelet, who you might remember from my BMI video, started talking about how you could could measure features of the human body and find statistical averages of those features. This eventually became the field of anthropometry, and it was a big deal. People hadn't really applied math and statistics to anatomy before, and it was George Combe, that Scottish phrenologist, who took this idea and ran with it. Phrenology hadn't used statistics in its 30 years of existence, so in 1824, Combe decided to integrate Quetelet's idea of statistical averages and use calipers to measure head sizes. Other phrenologists did the same and printed tables with head circumferences and measurements in different journals, but they rarely gathered data themselves. See, the system was built off of qualitative descriptions and subjective drawings of outliers, the least intelligent, the insane, or criminal. And while academics might have found this stuff interesting, regular people really only cared about phrenology if it said something about themselves. And there was one family who gave America exactly what they wanted. Introducing Orson and Lorenzo Fowler. They heard about phrenology in college and saw the money-making potential right away. This was also the heyday of a bunch of other pop science sideshows like mesmerism, eclecticism, and hydrotherapy, so phrenology was part of a bigger cultural movement of medical grifters. The Fowlers became popular in the late 1830s by holding lecture tours, running a shop in New York where they sold books, and of course, by doing phrenology readings. People would consult a phrenologist before making big decisions like deciding who to marry, or they'd go to them for advice about how to raise their kids. Usually people would visit the phrenologist at their house, then the doctor would poke around their head for a bit, and then they'd get a neat little write-up about their personality and character. Here's one from Lorenzo Fowler. It had the different organs or faculties listed, the size of yours, and what that meant about your personality. But other phrenologists had their own version. This one from Chipperfield used a scale of 1 to 7 and has some real hidden gems, like how's your self-esteem? This guy only scored a 3. When's the last time you considered your sublimity or mirthfulness? Also, I love this physiology section. Like, what is organic quality? Why does health only get a single number? And is digestive power good or bad? I can't tell. It sounds messy. All in all, thousands of people got these readings done on them. But the Fowler's most lasting impact is this thing, the Phrenology bust. It's a bright white porcelain bust modeled after a man with a narrow chin and enormous cranium. On the front, Phrenology is in big block letters with the Fowler branding. On the back, a little spiel about how phrenology is supposed to work. The Fowler family also got really into print material, which helped them stay in the popular zeitgeist. In 1838, they acquired a journal called the American Phrenological Journal, which was mainly aimed at a medical audience. The Fowlers transitioned the journal into more of a generalist reform magazine, which wrote more about abolition and education. Even beyond phrenology, the Fowler family was super influential. Lorenzo's wife Lydia was the second woman in the United States after Elizabeth Blackwell to get a medical degree, which means that yes, Lydia was more educated than her husband, which was rare for the time. She was an early suffragette and taught women better hygiene and health. And Orson was responsible for making octagonal-shaped houses a thing in America. There's a great episode of 99% Invisible about it, which I'll link down in the description. Now, the Fowlers were the most popular American phrenologists, but a few estimates say that there were thousands of others in the US over the 19th century. Fast forward to the mid to late 1800s, and phrenology is starting to fizzle out. But it's hard to tell exactly if or when phrenology ended. Like, the Fowlers' Phrenology Journal lasted until 1911, and the British Phrenological Society had active members into the 1940s. And what makes that question even more complicated is how phrenology left a massive impact on other areas of science. So now we're in the mid-1800s, and while some scientists are still on board with phrenology, it mostly exists just in pop culture. But at this point, we're starting to see where phrenology is leading. We'll start with the good stuff. Remember, there was still debate about whether the brain was one homogeneous organ or made of different specialized areas, the idea of cerebral localization. One day in 1840, a 30-year-old man named Louis Victor Leborgne started having difficulty with speaking, and eventually he lost the ability to speak altogether. He died 21 years later, and a French doctor named Paul Broca performed an autopsy on him. Some of Broca's mentors were big into phrenology, and they likely influenced him to think about the brain like a phrenologist, that is to say, through the lens of cerebral localization theory. So he did the autopsy and suspected he'd find damage to one specific area of the brain. Sure enough, Broca found a lesion in the left frontal lobe, which he eventually called Broca's area, and concluded that that must be the region responsible for speech. This helped solidify the idea of cerebral localization in neuroscience to this day. So yeah, phrenology did lead to something useful, but it was also used to justify racism, colonialism, and slavery. In 1825, George Combe published A System of Phrenology, which included a table of head shapes and sizes of different races, which you can see represented in this poster. They threw in a few animal skulls to suggest that the skulls of African folks more closely resembled apes, then they resembled white people. Along with anthropometry more broadly, white scientists could use these observations to make generalizations about bodies of color that sounded like they were backed up by data. Then, they could arbitrarily decide that their own anatomy was better suited for intelligence and domination. I'll give you an example. Starting in the 1820s, white folks in Calcutta did phrenological research on Indian school kids, and over the next few decades, used it to categorize Indian people into different races. Combe claimed that the Hindu brain indicates a manifest deficiency in the organs of combativeness and destructiveness, while in the European, these parts are amply developed. And French phrenologist Charles Caldwell argued that the skulls of Africans showed evidence of tameableness that made them good slaves. Basically, phrenology was a tool that reinforced colonialism and slavery by making it seem like the established hierarchy was just there because of biology. Now, I mentioned at the top of the video that people were really into collecting skulls too. Well, this is Samuel G. Morton, and he had possibly the biggest skull collection of any individual in North America, and he was a big-time white supremacist. He collected over 1,000 specimens, including lots of stolen indigenous American skulls, and he used his collection to argue that white people were more intelligent and rightfully suited to dominate everyone else. He wrote a book called Crania, Americana, which he prefaced by saying how much he loved phrenology and how George Combe wrote him an essay and gave him his personal blessing for the book. Then, using his collection as evidence, he described Caucasians as distinguished for the facility with which it attains the highest intellectual endowments, while Native Americans are averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, and wholly destitute of maritime adventure. Also, I'm not the only one who thinks that's a weird description, right? This guy really said, they're lazy, they lack intelligence, they're warmongers, and they don't even like sailing. I'm sorry, I gotta find some levity somewhere in this section. Again, he's justifying all of this with subjective, hand-wavy observations about his own skull collection. Here's how he wrote about it. This is from the appendix. He says that independence, civilization, and political freedom are the results of large aggregate sizes of brain, the moral and intellectual regions predominating in the majority of the people, aided by long cultivation, like seen in white people. When it came to the Native American tribes that had been conquered, the coronal and intellectual regions in their brains are larger in proportion to that of the animal propensities than in the brains of the Hurons, which have constantly receded before the Europeans, who have resisted subjection but been exterminated. Morton is communicating two things here, both with the content and the prose. The content lines up with everything else we've learned about phrenology up to this point. Your brain predicts your characteristics. But if you noticed, his writing style communicates something deeper. He says that tribes have resisted subjection but been exterminated, instead of Caucasians have subjected, and Caucasians have exterminated the tribe. Instead of using the active voice, his writing makes it seem like one's biology predestines them to their fate. To Morton, it wasn't his own prejudice that justified the forced removal of Native Americans, it was science. Coincidentally, he published Crania Americana right in the middle of the Trail of Tears. And as we'll see in a future video, it wouldn't be the last time policymakers used pseudoscience to justify extermination. Okay, that was a lot of heavy stuff. I want to end this video on a more hopeful note. How did society reject phrenology? The short answer is that it ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. By the mid-1800s, most people considered phrenologists to be in the same category as horoscope readers or psychics, and the enthusiasm for phrenology just fizzled out. Part of that was because of the lack of any real scientific basis. A critic at the time might ask the totally logical question of, y'all said this brain organ was big, but big in relation to what? What's your reference point? Or what is the size of the average brain or average skull that I'm being compared to? The lack of quantifiable, data-driven answers made it clear that any phrenology practitioner was just using their personal judgment and making subjective decisions. But there was one man who went to the extreme to prove the whole field wrong. His name was Joseph Hürtel, a Viennese anatomist who collected over 139 skulls that are currently housed in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. This footage was actually shared with me by the Mutter, so big thanks to them. Hürtel was initially trying to make the field of comparative anatomy a thing. This is where you compare human anatomy to other animals or human anatomy. To him, there was no such thing as better or worse anatomy, just different. When Hürtel acquired a skull, he'd document the name, birthplace, age, occupation, and whenever possible, the cause of death of the person. Now, most of these skulls did come from the marginalized and working class, which were the usual anatomy subjects of the time. Check out my video on Grey's Anatomy for more on that. But unlike Morton, Hurdle thought that the skulls taught you nothing about someone's personality. His skull collection varied a ton. Some skulls were big, some were small, and they all had bumps everywhere and in unpredictable locations. In his own words, the functions of the individual parts of the brain are so puzzling that a doctrine which attempts to delimit the abilities of a human being by measuring the skull could only be invented by idiots for idiots. I mean, the man did not mince words. He was saying that skulls were so varied and so unexceptional that there was no pattern to be found. He was using Morton's technique to prove the null hypothesis. He was saying that the available data does not point to any discernible difference. The movement might have been dying already, but Hurdle provided its death blow. So wrapping it all up, phrenology was relatively short-lived, but it still has an impact in modern day. You might see references to phrenology in art and design, like this image of Jeff Bezos from an article in The Atlantic in 2019, or this image of Kanye West. But that's the fun legacy of phrenology. The darker side is a little more complicated. Phrenology got popular in a time when colonialism and slavery were already in full swing, and having any kind of science say that these things were not only okay, but natural was a huge boon to the power structures in place. And this kind of thinking is what inspired the next chapter of scientific racism: eugenics.